The United States government commands the largest intelligence apparatus and the most sophisticated financial regulatory network in human history. Yet it remains fundamentally incapable of predicting its own systemic collapses. From the devastation of the 1929 stock market crash to the structural failure of the 2008 financial crisis, the baseline stability of the Western world has repeatedly shattered without warning. But an examination of the historical data reveals that these crises were not unpredictable anomalies. The warnings were clearly recorded in real time. The problem is that the systems designed to protect the global economy consistently misinterpret major warning signs, treat extreme danger as economic growth, or allow political theater to blind their analysis. This matters because the global financial system is built entirely on the illusion of continuous predictability. When a systemic shock occurs, the rules of wealth distribution are instantly rewritten. The winners are decentralized, opportunistic entities that exploit structural blind spots to hedge against impending chaos. The losers are ordinary people whose savings, jobs, and pensions are completely wiped out by an institutional failure they did not cause. If the world's primary economic superpower is continuously blind to its own vulnerabilities, the safety of the global economy is entirely a function of chance. Why does the American establishment consistently ignore the structural warnings that precede a total collapse? To understand this repetitive blind spot, we must examine the global framework of risk assessment and institutional forecasting. The modern international economy relies on an architectural assumption that risk can be scientifically managed, measured, and neutralized through continuous data tracking and regulatory oversight. This system exists because global capital requires stability to function efficiently. If investors believe that a marketplace is prone to random, unpreventable collapses, they withdraw their liquidity, causing credit to dry up and economic output to contract. Under standard cause and effect market logic, regulatory agencies use massive data modeling to track variables like debt-to-GDP ratios, asset valuations, and industrial production. The goal is to create an early warning mechanism, an invisible diagnostic dashboard that signals when a market is overheating. This allows policymakers to adjust interest rates or impose capital requirements before a structural break occurs. However, the foundation of this system is compromised by a phenomenon known as systemic leverage. Systemic leverage occurs when financial institutions borrow massive amounts of money to invest in complex assets, creating a chain of debt that connects the entire global economy. When one link breaks, the entire chain is threatened. The regulatory dashboard is designed to monitor individual links, but it frequently fails to comprehend the sheer weight of the entire chain. The historical precedent for this recurring pattern of institutional blindness was established in the run-up to the 1929 market crash. During the 1920s, the United States experienced a massive industrial boom driven by the widespread commercialization of automobiles and electricity. The economic incentive for ordinary citizens and Wall Street institutions was clear. They borrowed heavily to buy into a stock market that appeared to possess an endless upward trajectory. Investors developed a dangerous groupthink, convincing themselves that new industrial efficiencies had rendered the standard business cycle completely obsolete. Because the surface indicators, skyrocketing stock prices and robust urban consumption, looked spectacular, regulators completely ignored structural decay in the broader economy. Severe drops in industrial production and widespread agricultural distress were occurring simultaneously across the American heartland. But these macroeconomic red flags were systematically rejected as insignificant noise by an establishment blinded by speculative overconfidence. The power dynamics of the era placed absolute trust in private financiers, stripping the government of the political will to intervene. This historical failure established a template. When a financial boom enriches the political and economic elite, the institutions tasked with oversight face immense pressure to ignore any data that threatens the prevailing prosperity. The institutional mechanism that causes America to miss these critical warnings operates through three distinct structural blind spots. When these variables align, they mask a building crisis until the point of inevitable failure. The first variable is the misinterpretation of systemic leverage as legitimate financial growth. In the years preceding the 2008 financial crisis, massive gross financial flows, surges in corporate bond purchases, and excessive lending within the unregulated network of non-bank financial intermediaries created an illusion of absolute stability. Rating agencies consistently overstated the quality of complex, debt-heavy assets, stamping subprime mortgage bundles with top-tier ratings. Because housing prices were surging, regulators viewed this explosion of credit as a sign of financial innovation, rather than an unsustainable buildup of systemic debt. The warning was treated as the engine of growth. The second variable is the diversion of institutional focus caused by domestic political turmoil. Prior to major historic failures, including the September 11th attacks and the 2008 financial meltdown, intelligence and economic agencies possessed early indicators of an active, escalating threat. However, in both instances, the state's processing capacity was paralyzed by high-level political transitions, shifting foreign policy priorities, and domestic administrative scandals. When a government's leadership becomes entirely entrenched in short-term political preservation, the systemic urgency required to process long-term, transnational risks falls by the wayside. The third variable is the absolute rejection of warning signals due to institutional groupthink. Ahead of catastrophic market events, contrary data is actively dismissed by an establishment that assumes the fundamentals of their system are structurally sound. Policymakers and analysts refuse to believe radical change or collapse is possible, creating a feedback loop where extreme risk is mathematically categorized as statistical noise. The economic consequences of this systemic blindness are felt across every tier of global society. The immediate winners are short sellers and predatory financial institutions that retain the liquidity needed to buy up distressed real estate and corporate assets for pennies on the dollar. They consolidate their wealth on an unprecedented scale precisely because they recognize the signals the establishment ignores. For governments, the consequence is a permanent structural deficit. To prevent a complete collapse of the global trading model during a crisis, the state is forced to deploy massive emergency measures, transferring private toxic debt directly onto the public balance sheet. This expands national debt, forces long-term austerity measures, and severely limits the state's capacity to invest in infrastructure, education, or healthcare for generations. For ordinary people, the short-term impact is a brutal, unmitigated loss of economic agency. When systemic leverage unravels, the resulting credit freeze instantly triggers mass corporate layoffs, home foreclosures, and the destruction of retirement funds. In the long term, this repetitive failure breeds deep societal distrust. Citizens realize that the regulatory institutions tasked with overseeing the market are structurally incapable of protecting them, fueling widespread political polarization and undermining the baseline stability of democratic systems. This structural reality exposes the fundamental misunderstanding that shapes the public perception of major historical crises. The common narrative, often reinforced by retrospective commission reports, is that these events are unprecedented anomalies, completely unpredictable occurrences that no one could have possibly seen coming. What this narrative completely gets wrong is confusing an institutional refusal to look with an inability to see. The data preceding the 1929, 2001, and 2008 crises was not hidden. It was actively published on financial ledgers and discussed in internal intelligence briefings. The failure is never a lack of data, but the existence of an institutional filter that systematically discards negative variables that contradict the prevailing political consensus. If an economic model assumes that real estate values can never decline nationwide, or that a complex financial market is completely self-regulating, the system will explicitly label any data pointing to a collapse as statistical noise. The establishment does not miss the signal. It intentionally turns off the receiver. The persistence of these institutional blind spots points toward a few highly realistic future outcomes. In the first scenario, the proliferation of decentralized shadow financial networks outpaces regulatory visibility entirely. As capital increasingly shifts into complex, opaque digital assets and private credit markets outside the jurisdiction of central banks, traditional data tracking becomes entirely obsolete. This condition creates an environment where a massive systemic leverage crisis can develop completely undetected, triggering a sudden freeze in liquidity that paralyzes the global economy before regulators even realize a vulnerability exists. In a second scenario, the intersection of domestic political polarization and bureaucratic paralysis completely breaks the state's defensive response. Entrenched in continuous, high-intensity domestic political warfare and administrative turnover, Washington remains permanently distracted from emerging long-term macroeconomic signals. This allows a major external shock, such as a coordinated shift away from the US dollar by foreign central banks, to trigger a rapid structural unwinding of American debt markets. Without coordinated defensive intervention from the Treasury or the Federal Reserve, the ensuing crisis would dismantle the current global financial order. The stability of the global superpower is ultimately built on an architecture of historical amnesia. We began by observing an intelligence and regulatory network with unmatched resources, only to discover a recurring mechanism of structural blindness that systematically ignores the clear warnings of impending collapse. The warning signs of the next great crisis are likely already propagating through global capital accounts, recorded as subtle anomalies on the balance sheets of massive financial institutions. But as long as institutional overconfidence, political distractions, and a refusal to acknowledge systemic leverage remain embedded in the establishment's matrix, the pattern will inevitably repeat. If the primary defense mechanism of the world's largest economy is structurally designed to misinterpret its own vulnerabilities as signs of health, we are left with a quiet, unsettling question. What critical signal is the American financial system ignoring right now? And how long do we have before the invisible breaking point becomes an undeniable reality?